Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be both the first day of Litmus and my weekly reading wrap-up. The 12 Days of Litmus were created by Adrian and Dalton from Stripped Cover Lit, and I will link to their announcement video below. The 12 Days of Litmus is a 12-day daily video challenge. Last year's had a lot to do with one's reading history, and this year's has a lot more to do with the community and also some immediate reading of the year. The prompt for the first day is to name the best friend that you have made on BookTube this year. And I'm actually recording this on the day, so I've already seen what some people have done for it, and it's been, for a lot of people, it seems to have been a bit of a shout-out video. And I'm going to do something a little bit different because I consider many more than 4 people to be great friends that I've made through BookTube, both this year and over the years. And I think I might rather do a shout-out video at some other time. But what I will say is that one of my favorite things that I've started doing is trying to greet everybody who makes one of the newbie tags. Even if a lot of the people aren't people whose interests or whose styles overlap with mine, I really enjoy going in and just saying hello to them. Because I know when I first joined the community, and I did the new to BookTube tag instead of the newbie tag, which is a little bit less popular, but it still was really gratifying when people came and said hi to me. So I'm just gonna throw out there that if you have some free time and you don't track the new to BookTube or BookTube newbie tags, maybe give it a shot and go say hello to some new people. That's been a lot of fun. It was something I appreciated 2.5 years ago when I started my channel, and I try to kind of pay that forward, and I love that. And you never know, that may be the start of your new best friend. So, okay, time for the reading wrap-up. I was gonna make these 2 separate videos, but then I thought, that's just silly. Let's just make it all in one. So one book that I own but have misplaced, and it's bright orange, so I can't believe that I've lost it, but I'm sure it'll turn up as soon as I finish filming this, was Naben Ruthnum's Curry, Eating, Reading, and Race, which is a book in Coach House Books' series of basically conversation starters. They're essentially long essays. This in particular is a look at both food and literature in a South Asian diaspora marketing sense, in which he argues basically that curry as an individual object doesn't exist, which is both true and not true depending on the angle that you approach it from. His perspective is particularly formed by being from Kelowna and being of Indo-Mauritian heritage. So he has a perception of Indianness and possibly Hindu-ness that is both removed by several generations and removed by more than one country. And also by being from Kelowna, he has a very different perspective that someone who grew up in a more diverse place like a Vancouver or a Toronto would have. So from the personal essay perspective, it was quite interesting. From a general cultural critique perspective, he basically constantly undermined his own points, because in a lot of cases he hadn't read all the material that he refers to, and also in a number of cases he admits to a certain level of bias but then plows through, which I think sometimes has somewhat unfortunate implications. There's a bit where he's complaining about the movie Bend It Like Beckham, and you kind of get the feeling that this is an argument that he is probably not the best person to make, since he talks about watching this with his family as a 20-year-old man. And even though he acknowledges that this is a movie that meant something to people who were younger at the time that they saw it and who were female, I winced a little bit at that because I felt like some of that argument probably was correct, but the way in which he was running at it felt a bit like it probably it wasn't exactly his place to do that. So that I thought was a little uncomfortable. As the book goes on, he makes a couple of comments that he lives in Toronto now, and he makes a couple of comments about geography that made me believe that he spent a lot of time downtown and doesn't actually know the layout of the city properly. He refers to places that are in the city as ex-urban, which should be far-reaching suburbs. I mean, I think you could use that term to describe Whitby. You shouldn't be describing that term to talk about Lawrence East. Eventually, near the end, he seems to be basically justifying his use of a pen name for the thrillers that he writes, which I wasn't a huge fan of. So even though I don't completely buy into his ideas, I did think it was an interesting read and definitely worth reading, maybe in conjunction with more serious writing that didn't seem to have that quite as much of a, here's why I chose this pen name to the end of it, because I didn't think it was as well researched as it could be. But as a conversation starter, which is what these are published as, this did a good job, so hey. I followed that up by reading another book from that series from Coach House, and that is Jeet Heer's In Love with Art. This is a very short biography of Françoise Mouly, who was an editor at Raw and later the art and comics editor for The New Yorker. The way the introduction to this is written, he's almost writing this as an apology for having dismissed her contributions to the changes in the history of American comics in the 70s, because he once wrote about Art Spiegelman, who both was her co-editor and is her husband, and basically brushed off her influence on those changes. And so this is a bit of an apology for that, I think. Because it is so short, and because that does seem to be the angle that he's going into this with, it presents her in an almost entirely positive light, and I'm always suspicious of biographies that are so positive. It is also so short that it can't go into a lot of detail. But as a conversation starter, I did think this had some really interesting parts, including a line about how, as someone who grew up with the French comics tradition as opposed to the American comics tradition, which even when they were writing about children's stories are formatted in a more long-standing way, which is the album style as opposed to the floppy style, which I thought was really interesting, and which I might do a separate discussion video about, because I really enjoyed the idea of that, even though, again, it's not something I 100% agree with, but I thought it was interesting. So I did enjoy reading this for what it was. There just wasn't much to it, and I hope to someday read a longer biography of Françoise Mouly. Next up, I read My Cat Yugoslavia by Pajtim Statovci, which tells two parallel stories, one of which is about a young man in Finland in more or less the current day, who is someone who immigrated to Finland as a child, as a refugee from Kosovo, who is basically dealing with romantic drama and school drama in his life. He's dropping out of and rejoining university and hooking up with random men and just kind of dealing with his life and the traumas of his past. And in parallel, we get the story of his mother, first as a teenager in the 80s, and then going through her life in Kosovo back when it was part of Yugoslavia, through to the war and then moving to Finland. The story about the son, Bakim, tries a bit too hard to be Kafkaesque. At one point he is in a relationship with a talking cat and has a pet boa constrictor that is, while not as anthropomorphized as the cat, is clearly beating you over the head a bit with the symbolism, but I still thought this overall was pretty brilliant. It's a debut novel, and I think some of the choices were maybe not as successful as they could have been, but I still thought it made for a very interesting read. Especially, I will say as an aside, I had no idea that cats were seen as dirty in Albania. I think that's hilarious. I'm used to seeing people think dogs are dirty, but cats was funny. Which I bring up because it's very early on, we're told that there once was a tradition where a man would strangle a cat on his wedding night to show the woman how macho he is. And because we later have this talking cat who says a lot of insulting things to Bakim, you do get the idea that there's a challenge of macho-ness, like maybe he needs to strangle this cat, which isn't actually the direction that this takes, and it goes in directions that I think are actually a little bit more interesting, and ponders a lot of questions about cultures in interaction with each other, both the immigrant/refugee experience and about cultural shift in both Finland and Kosovo. I've seen very mixed reviews for this. Some people really like it and some people loathe it. I know this was on Sean the Books Maniac's least favorite books of last year list, which is how I originally heard about it, and I completely understand why this irritates some people and why they did not enjoy Bakim's side of this as opposed to Amina, the mother's side of this, because Amina's story is a much more traditional story, and I think is the story that I think more people would be interested in addition to it being more traditionally told. But I did think that even though the anthropomorphic cat bit didn't work 100%, it definitely worked for me. I'm also going to say that I got an extra amusing bit for this because I was having a conversation with a Finnish acquaintance of mine who was really insistent that Finns in particular, but also Europeans in general, are just not racist the way North Americans are. And I thought, you know, the kind of xenophobia and Islamophobia that does exist is not particularly different from racism. And, you know, I think this gets into this because, of course, the son character is someone who was raised in Finland and he is essentially agnostic. And he's still experiencing a lot of prejudice just based on his name and where his family was from. So, you know, if you don't think that's the same as racism, or that's somewhat more rational because it's okay to dislike people because of whatever religion they might culturally belong to, even if they're not at all observant, or, you know, what country their parents came from. Anyway, that's an aside that probably doesn't matter. I may have to edit a lot of this video out. Next up, I read something that was hideous and that I regret wasting the 45 minutes that it took to read this, and this was a novella called Trapped Nerves by Drew Hunt. This is very loosely a formulaic romance in which two men who were teenage sweethearts meet in an elevator 20 years later, and they're trapped in the elevator and have to deal with each other. One of the characters is someone who used to play American football. This is a British author who clearly doesn't like sports of any kind, from if the style of the writing is any basis, and the dialect stuff is wrong, the disability stuff, it's a little stereotyped and not with a reason. I think there are ways you can write stereotypical situations and not have them be the stereotype for negative reasons, and this didn't do it. It was just trash in basically every way. So I'm not going to talk much about that because it had basically no redeeming features in terms of story or character. It was just awful. After that, I read another novella, and that was Peter Darling by Austin Chant. I saw a number of people mention this in videos for the Queer Lit Readathon that was going on during the first week of December. This is a Peter Pan sequel of sorts, in which Peter is Wendy and goes back to Neverland as an adult, basically to escape the reality of the family's expectations, and has some interactions with Captain Hook that eventually turn into a romance story. Personally, I really enjoyed the Captain Hook stuff more so than the Peter Pan material, but some of that is just my interests. Even though this was a novella, it was a quick read even for that. It was very engaging, it was fun, and I was ready to give this quite a high rating on Goodreads, but I went and walked the dog before I entered it, and as I was walking around, I realized that because it takes out the Tiger Lily character, because of course that has some racial stereotyping going on, so I understand why that's gone, but by Peter being Wendy, it means that this is a story that had some major female characters and now is entirely male, which wouldn't necessarily bother me. I read a lot of war fiction. Obviously, I read lots of stories in which there are virtually no women. But because this is playing with ideas of both gender stereotypes and kind of exploring gender expectations, it stands out a bit more. And I don't think the plot is meant to be drawing attention to that, but I think because of the other things that are in the background, it does draw the eye, and so that I thought was a little iffy. So even though I thought this was very engaging, I didn't rate it as highly as the fun factor would have led me to rate it, because I thought there was a lot of unintentional stuff going on that wasn't poked. And again, this is a novella and it was very entertaining, but if certain doors are open and you don't explore it, that sort of leaves a gap. But I really liked the way the Captain Hook stuff worked, because I think Captain Hook is a character that, I guess to kind of compare it to the other novel, which I thought dealt with disability in a terrible way, it only had a couple of lines that touched on that, but it dealt with it well, so points to that. Right, apparently I didn't take a screenshot of the cover of this before I returned it, but I also read Volume 2 of the new Batwoman comic, which is written by Marguerite Bennett and drawn by Fernando Blanco. I really love Fernando Blanco's art, so I did take a screenshot of one page of that. I love the way he does action pieces. I love the way he draws like character expression and captures motion. The colorist, I think, didn't do a great job in some parts, because I really like the black-red contrast, and that's actually the main reason I read Batwoman comics, because I really like the way that looks, and the red is often orange in this, so the colorist didn't do a great job of that, or maybe that was intentional, but I think it takes away from the overall piece. Story-wise, it was fine. I wasn't particularly impressed or disappointed with it. The issue that I have with a lot of Marguerite Bennett's writing is that when she's writing something fun and fluffy, she's great, and when it gets more serious, I just don't feel like she ever gets the tone quite right. That's the issue I always have with Bombshells. When it is being superficial and an exercise in kind of visual experimentation and fun and, you know, just those alternative versions of the characters, I think it's good. But on the occasions when she's dealt with more serious issues in that, I don't think it works, and it always feels a little glib. So I mean, I overall enjoyed it, but mostly because I like Fernando Blanco's art. And just this morning I finished Ayesha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin, who is a parenting and lifestyle columnist at the Toronto Star. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, which normally I would avoid because I don't like Regency romance type stories in general, But this was set in Scarborough, and if you've followed for a while, I enjoy some, I always give bonus points for something that's set in Toronto and extra bonus points for Scarborough. And I'm going to say that unlike Catherine Hernandez's Scarborough or David Cherry Andrews' brother, this feels like my Scarborough, which is something that I complained about with those ones, in part because they're further south, but in part because they were so bleak and depressing, and this is not bleak and depressing, this is a goofy romance. And I thought that was lovely. Early in the book, there are descriptions of neighborhoods, and it could be my mother's neighborhood. The mosque that the characters in this go to feels like a cross between two that are in the neighborhood, and I enjoyed that. Everybody goes for donuts all the time. So even though this is not my kind of plot at all, it got bonus points, and I read this within 24 hours just because I loved those elements so much. And I just really enjoyed seeing something that felt like the neighborhood and that felt like people I know. The male love interest in this, Khaled, is just like people I know. It's actually so much like someone I know that I almost wanted to text people and tell them tell them they needed to read this because it's so hilariously like someone I know. So yeah, this was great fun. Is this a great novel? No, not really. It even has lines that are clearly adapted from Pride and Prejudice. So you either like that or think that's cheesy. I do think it's a little cheesy, but I like the atmosphere so much that I didn't care. It does a lot of the mistaken identity stuff that I don't like. It's one of my least favorite cliches that we get in this kind of book, but again, I forgave it because I liked the trappings. There's actually one point at the end where a character has a makeover and then he comments, "No one's ever called me honey before," but we actually saw someone calling him honey early in the book, so I thought some editor should have caught that. So there were definitely flaws in this, but I cannot be rational in my review of this because I loved the setting so much. But I'm not going to talk more about it because, as I said, I cannot be rational because it has a lot of things that I didn't like, but I still loved it. So there we go. If you're doing the 12 days of Litmus, let me know so I can check out your videos. I know I've seen some people's already because I am filming this late. Anyway, I hope you had a good week and have a great weekend. That's it for now. Ciao.